Today we're diving into 10 fascinating reasons why 1960s Britain looked so clean and sharp, exploring the social pressures, economic realities, and cultural expectations that created a nation where appearance genuinely mattered. You might be surprised to discover just how different life really was and why we can never quite recapture that particular look, no matter how much we might want to. Let's step back into a Britain where standards were high, choices were limited, and looking scruffy simply wasn't an option. The shops in 1960s Britain offered nothing like the overwhelming variety we see today. Your local high street might have had 3 or 4 clothing shops at most, each stocking carefully curated selections that changed with the seasons rather than weekly. Mass production hadn't yet created the disposable fashion culture we know now. When you bought a coat or a dress, you expected it to last for years, not months. This scarcity meant people chose carefully, maintained what they owned, and developed a distinctive personal style within quite narrow parameters. Everyone shopped from essentially the same limited palette, which created a certain visual cohesion across communities. This uniformity extended to men's fashion particularly severely. A man's wardrobe consisted of work clothes, casual clothes, and Sunday best with very little crossover. Trousers came in navy, gray, brown, or black. Shirts were white, or perhaps pale blue. Jumpers were conservative colors, nothing loud or attention-seeking. The restricted choice actually made dressing simpler, because there were established rules everyone understood. You didn't agonize over endless options or worry about being on trend, because trends moved glacially slowly and everyone had access to roughly the same things. This created streets full of people who looked coordinated without even trying. A decent winter coat in 1963 might cost the equivalent of 2 weeks' wages for an average worker. That single fact changed everything about how people approached clothing. When a garment represented such a significant investment, you treated it with respect. You mended it when needed. You stored it properly. And you certainly didn't throw it away because you fancied something different. Working-class families often saved for months to buy school uniforms or a new suit. The financial weight of clothing meant wardrobes were smaller, but quality was often higher. Even for modest earners who couldn't afford the very best, but still bought things built to last. This expense created a natural break on throwaway culture that simply didn't exist yet. People knew the exact cost of replacing items, so stains were treated immediately. Tears were sewn up, buttons were replaced, collars were turned when they frayed. Dry cleaning was used sparingly, because it cost money, so people were more careful about keeping clothes clean in the first place. Children wore hand-me-downs without shame because everyone did it. The economics of clothing created a population that looked after what they owned. And well-maintained clothing always looks smarter than disposable fashion, even if the actual garments are quite simple. The invisible rules about appearance in 1960s Britain were absolutely rigid, though rarely written down anywhere. Everyone simply knew that you didn't go into town looking scruffy. You didn't answer the door in your dressing gown. You didn't sit in your front garden in your vest. The neighborhood judgment was real and powerful. Curtains twitched, tongues wagged, and reputations could be damaged by persistent scruffiness. This wasn't necessarily kind, but it did create powerful incentives to maintain standards even when you didn't particularly feel like it. Women particularly felt this pressure intensely. Leaving the house without proper makeup, with curlers still in your hair, or wearing trousers to anything other than casual occasions could genuinely mark you as common or slovenly. Men were expected to wear ties for most public occasions, to keep their hair neat, to shine their shoes. Young people might rebel against these standards, but even the rebels dressed carefully in their chosen style, whether it was mauve-sharp suits or rocker leather jackets. The social contract around appearance meant that looking smart wasn't optional. It was a basic expectation of participating in public life, rather like speaking politely or queuing properly. National service had only ended in 1960, which meant huge numbers of British men in the 1960s had spent 2 years in military service, learning rigid standards of presentation. They'd been inspected daily, taught to iron with hospital corners, trained to shine boots until they gleamed, and had the importance of smartness and discipline quite literally drilled into them. These habits didn't disappear the moment they took off the uniform. millions of men carried those standards into civilian life, maintaining the same attention to detail in their appearance that had been forced upon them in the forces. This created a generation of fathers who passed on those exacting standards to their children. Young boys learned to polish their school shoes properly, to part their hair neatly, to stand up straight. The military influence filtered through families and workplaces, creating a baseline expectation of smartness that affected even people who'd never been near a parade ground. The psychological impact of having such a large proportion of the male population trained in immaculate presentation standards cannot be overstated. It created a cultural memory of what smart looked like and an expectation that ordinary men could and should achieve it in their daily lives. Britain in 1960 was only 15 years past the end of the Second World War and had only recently emerged from rationing, which had continued into the early 1950s. People who'd lived through genuine austerity, who'd made do and mended out of absolute necessity, who'd seen their cities bombed and their lives disrupted, had developed an incredible resilience and pride. Looking smart was a way of showing that Britain was recovering, that ordinary people weren't beaten down, that life was getting better. There was almost a defiant quality to the smartness, a determination to present well despite everything. This generation understood the difference between genuine poverty and simply having less choice than we have now. They'd experienced real hardship, so the relative prosperity of the 1960s, modest though it was, felt like abundance. Having a good coat, being able to buy new shoes rather than having them repaired again, affording a decent haircut, these were genuine achievements to be proud of. The collective memory of harder times made people appreciate what they had and show it off through their appearance. Looking smart was a visible sign of Britain's recovery, and people took genuine pride in contributing to that image of a nation getting back on its feet. When having your photograph taken was an infrequent and significant event, rather than a daily occurrence, people approached it with appropriate seriousness. You didn't own a camera unless you were quite keen or relatively affluent. Most families had perhaps a handful of photos taken each year at weddings, christenings, on holiday if you were lucky. Because photographs were rare and permanent, people dressed up for them, stood properly, composed themselves. These formal photos then became the visual record of the era, showing everyone at their absolute best, creating an archival image of the 1960s as a decade where everyone looked immaculate. This formality extended beyond planned photography to the way people presented themselves generally. You never knew when you might end up in a photo, whether at a family gathering or a community event. So maintaining standards at all times was sensible. The absence of casual selfie culture meant people didn't document their rough days, their lazy weekends, their dressed-down moments. The visual legacy of the era is therefore naturally skewed towards smartness. Because only the smart occasions were recorded, we remember the decade as sharper than it was, because we're seeing it through the selective lens of formal photography that captured people when they'd made an effort. Without modern washing machines in most homes until the late 1960s, doing laundry was serious physical labor involving scrubbing boards, mangles, and genuine effort. Many households still used the local laundrette or sent items to commercial cleaners. This difficulty meant you couldn't casually throw things in the wash daily as we do now. You wore clothes multiple times before washing them, which created powerful incentives to keep them clean in the first place. People were more careful about spills, more cautious about sitting on dirty surfaces, more conscious of not sweating too heavily in good clothes. The labor-intensive nature of washing also meant clothes were often starched and pressed very carefully because you'd gone to all that effort anyway. Shirts came back from the laundry or off your ironing board with crisp collars and sharp creases. Trousers had proper pressed lines down the front. Everything had a freshly laundered smartness, because the effort involved in washing demanded that you then finish the job properly with careful ironing. Modern easy care fabrics and quick wash cycles have made us careless. When washing meant several hours of hard work, people took genuine pride in the results, and that pride showed in how sharp their clothes looked. The 1960s was the last decade where most British people didn't own cars and relied primarily on public transport to get around. When you're taking the bus or train to work, to the shops, to visit relatives, you're constantly in public view, surrounded by your neighbors and community members. This created natural pressure to look presentable because you couldn't hide in your own car. You were on display. The bus queue, the train carriage, the tube platform, these were all social spaces where people noticed each other, and standards were maintained through collective observation. This public transport culture also meant people walked more, which required practical, well-maintained clothing. Shoes needed to be comfortable but smart because you might walk a mile to the bus stop and back. Coats needed to be weather appropriate and in good condition because you were standing at exposed bus stops. The practical requirements of a public transport lifestyle naturally encouraged well-maintained, sensible clothing. Compare this to our modern car culture, where people can leave home in pajamas, drive in isolation, and arrive without ever being seen properly. The social accountability of public transport helped maintain collective standards that have quietly eroded as we've become more isolated in our private vehicles. Getting your hair cut wasn't the casual affair it is today for men. The weekly or fortnightly visit to the barber was a ritual, often to the same barber you'd been using for years, who knew exactly how you liked it. Hair was kept short, neat, controlled. Even the rebellious longer styles of the mid to late 60s were carefully maintained and styled, not the casual shagginess that might pass today. Barbers were skilled craftsmen who took pride in sending you out looking sharp, and men took pride in maintaining that smartness between visits. Women's hair routines were even more involved. The weekly shampoo and set at the hairdresser was standard for many women, with elaborate rollers and vacuuming creating styles that had to last the week. Between salon visits, women slept in curlers and headscarves, maintaining the set through careful brushing and liberal application of hairspray. This meant women's hair was always styled, always controlled, always deliberately arranged rather than casually loose. The time and money invested in hair maintenance meant people showed it off proudly and certainly didn't waste it by looking unkempt. Hair standards were so rigid that even the youth rebellion around longer hair for men created carefully groomed longer styles, not genuine scruffiness. When television was still relatively new and programs were limited, what appeared on screen set powerful visual standards for the nation. Newsreaders wore dinner jackets, prisoners were immaculately turned out, even game show contestants dressed in their Sunday best. The BBC maintained incredibly high standards of presentation that reflected and reinforced societal expectations. Everyone on television looked smart, which created an implicit message that smartness was normal, expected, the standard you should aspire to in your own life. The formality of television extended to watching it as well. Many families would dress for evening viewing, treating it as an event rather than the casual background activity it's become. You didn't slouch in front of the television in your rattiest clothes because the television itself commanded a certain respect as this miraculous technology bringing the world into your living room. The visual culture of limited but formal television programming helped maintain broader social standards around appearance. When even the people on television who might have been expected to be relaxed maintained such high standards, it reinforced the expectation that ordinary people should do the same in their daily lives. What do you remember about how prisoners dressed back then? Looking back at why 1960s Britain appeared so clean and sharp reveals something profound about how we've changed as a society. Those pressed trousers and carefully coordinated outfits, those neat haircuts and polished shoes weren't just about vanity or conformity. They reflected a completely different way of living where community mattered more than individualism, where resources were limited but pride was abundant, where public life demanded standards that we've since decided are optional. We've gained comfort, choice, and casualness, but we've undoubtedly lost something, too, that collective smartness that made Britain look so distinctive in those decades after the